Yeah,
start. I will be in the back
absolutely.
and help you if you need it.
Okay, perfect.
Okay.
Well,
Bye.
thanks for having me. And I'll give a quick intro. So my name is Matt. I joined Ion 8 years ago as part of our rotational analyst program. So I went through my first job out of college and a number of different rotations. I also wear kind of two other hats. The first is I focus on ConnectX, which is sort of
I'll give a quick intro. So my
Okay.
name is Matt. I joined
Hello,
Ion,
Matt. It's me.
yeah, hello. I think there's a background noise. Anyway, so I work on ConnectX, which is a product that came out of some of the internal innovation we were working on at Ion to help us be more efficient in the way we managed our people. And I also have a startup, kind of a side project called Pangea, and it's focused in the travel space. So I'm going to talk a bit today about the new normal and sort of what has happened over the past couple of years, what is happening now, and then what the world needs for what's happening now to continue. So I think what has happened, a lot of us have lived through this, and I think it's a lot of this will resonate. If we go back to 2019, before the pandemic, there were a lot of joys that I think we're happy probably aren't part of our lives anymore. So getting to work and crowded commutes and bad traffic, whether it's on a road or a subway or public transit. There were some sort of not great things about the pre-pandemic world. And obviously COVID-19 hit and changed a lot of the way we lived our lives. It brought us all into our homes, and we spent a lot of time at home. And as a result, work, obviously, we needed to figure out how to pivot work to go from an in-person model to an at-home model. And companies like Zoom and others, Microsoft Teams, Slack, et cetera, did really, really well during this time. So the Zoom stock price went through the roof because every company in the world needed some way to start collaborating remotely and digitally. So we took what was in the office and we brought it home. And that was done very quickly, and that was done out of necessity. And there were some really good side effects of that. So one, there were more pets being adopted during the pandemic than any other time before because people had more time to interact with animals. So I think a really good outcome for obviously lots of animals in the world, and also for people who are able to adopt a pet and find the time in their busy day to do that. Things like Peloton also did really well during this time. So sales of Peloton, other at-home exercise equipment, did quite well. I think at the new sort of hybrid work, people were able to find pockets of time during their day to start to work out and do other things that were ultimately healthy for them and important for them. But anyone who was, either studying remotely or working remotely, I think we can all agree that it didn't look like this on all of the different Zoom and team calls. And it's quite fatiguing to be remote and digital all of the time. So as we're starting to recede from the pandemic and companies are now figuring out what's next, the question is, do we just go back to the way it was before? We just go back to an office 9 to 5, Monday to Friday? And I think the answer is probably not. But we have to look at if the pre-pandemic model was actually right. Was the pre-pandemic model optimized? And how should we architect a new way of working now that we have the technology, all these new technologies within organizations, and we have proven that people can work remotely? What does that look like? So if we look back at kind of the history of the 5-day work week, it was actually invented in 1926. Henry Ford typically gets the credit, and that's when he sort of shifted his factories away from the prevalent 6-day work week without reducing employee pay. And then we've been operating under that sort of model since then. And obviously the world has changed a lot since 1926, almost 100 years ago. But we still continue to have this sort of 5-day working concept. And I think that kind of ties to what's happening now as companies are grappling with what's next. What is the new normal? Things are obviously changing. And there's a number of places and companies that are now experimenting with a 4-day work week. So Unilever is running and has run this in New Zealand as a pilot. The Icelandic government ran this. Kickstarter and a couple of other smaller companies are all either experimenting or have announced fully that they're moving to a 4-day work week. And I think we'll start to see more of this. What they found is that productivity actually doesn't diminish in the 4-day work week in their operations. It's not a sort of guaranteed every week is exactly 4 days. There's some shifting and things like that and around deadlines. But in general, they found that productivity doesn't really drop and that people are way happier, not surprisingly, to have an extra day of the weekend. I think part of that can be credited to something called the Pareto principle. So you might have heard of the 80-20 rule, but basically 80% of the output generally comes from 20% of the input. And that's a fairly common rule. 80% of the work comes from 20% of the customers. 80% of the value that you're going to produce in your career comes from 20% of your time. So because of that, and because of that general rule, working longer doesn't necessarily translate to more and better output. And actually, if people are refreshed and focused, they're able to focus their time on the right things and get the right things done. But I think we need to think bigger of just taking the typical 5-day work week and shifting it down to 4 days or whatever. And that doesn't work in every single industry either. So there's a book I really like. It's called The 4-Hour Work Week. And I think this is probably more of a, something to catch our attention than anything else. It's by a guy named Tim Ferriss. He was involved in a number of ventures in the sort of .com era. Really interesting book and some really interesting principles about the way he has sort of lived his life and career. And one of the ones that I find most interesting is this concept of a deferred model versus a blended model. So the deferred model is the more traditional: work your career and your life and then retire and have some time to enjoy it at the end. And that's risky for a lot of reasons. And I think kind of shifting, especially as we're seeing more Gen Z enter the workforce, to more of a blended model where there's more of a desire to do things when you're younger. And in the book, he talks about taking mini retirements throughout your career rather than waiting until you're retired to take a full retirement. So how do you balance and really blend work and life and all of these different things together? And I think that's a really interesting concept that we're seeing way more of now that the pandemic has enabled people to work remotely, people to work from anywhere. And it really allows us to really rethink reality and redefine possible. So there's companies out there that are helping to enable this. So one that I have worked with closely and am a member of is a company called Outsite. They're a co-working, co-living concept. So they've got a location in Tulum in Mexico, about 50 feet from the beach. And it's pretty cool because everyone in the community is working full time. And they're working in different fields. Some are in startups, some are in bigger companies, consulting firms, large, Fortune 500, and all sorts of different roles, ranging from sales to marketing to development. And they're all working remotely from interesting locations for companies. And Outside has locations all around the world. So the idea is to sort of build your career, build your skills, continue to have that. But when you get off work, be somewhere interesting. Be in the Tulum Beach or Mexico City or somewhere else interesting in the world, and enabling this sort of more nomadic workforce. There's another one that's become quite popular, and they existed before the pandemic, but have really gotten some steam since the pandemic, called Remote Year. And they plan sort of either 1 week to generally 1 month to 12-month journeys where you are with a cohort of other people and you spend 1 month in various cities. Again, everyone's working a full-time job, and they provide accommodation, co-working space with monitors and good internet and things like that. But also a community. So on the weekends, you're exploring, you'll go hike Mount Kilimanjaro if you're doing the one in Tanzania, or something else. So they've got really interesting locations all over the world. And there's lots of these companies that are starting to pop up. And I think we'll continue to see this sort of trend away from, the 9 to 5 in office towards more interesting operating models. And it's interesting to see where it goes, because I think the people who are involved in these are typically sort of the mavericks who are running in that direction and are excited about these types of things. But the stats certainly are rising. And not surprisingly, in 2020, the number of Americans who describe themselves as digital nomads rose quite considerably. But what I find more interesting is that 58% of them have traditional jobs. So they're working in large organizations in various knowledge work. And that stat is expected to continue to rise. So 19 million more Americans plan to become digital nomads in the next 2 years, and 45 million more say maybe. So there's quite a lot of sort of demand, I think, within people to try this. And I think we'll see, because it's exciting and new. And I think some people will find it's probably not for them. But I think it's going to be interesting for companies to grapple with and figure out how to adapt to that as this demand continues to rise. So that kind of leads me to a question: is this the new normal? Everyone working sort of by themselves, independent from the company, fully remote? And I actually think no. I think that while that's sort of a nice ability from COVID to be able to work remote, to be able to work from different locations, it's not going to be what companies adopt fully. And I'm kind of interested to see, as more startups are going fully remote, how that will work in the sort of medium and long term. What I think will probably happen, and IBM's a good example of this, and they were a huge proponent of work from home. They had a lot of people consulting and on the road quite often. And in 2017, they actually called people back into the office because they saw productivity drop. And I think that is because face-to-face encounters are where innovation and creativity and other things take place. But they're not happening every day. So I think being in person with your team and being in person with others from your organization is an important part of a career journey, and also an important part of sort of innovation and coming up with interesting ideas. But we're not, having brainstorming sessions every single day with our teams. We're also executing the work. So what we need to do is figure out, when does it make sense to be in person, and when does it make sense to be or when is it okay, not impactful in a negative way, to be remote and away from others on your team. And I think it's about being intentional about when we go to the office, working around sort of company events. I think there's an important community and culture aspect. So knowing your coworkers, connecting with them is important within an organization. And also going in and having those sort of creative times when all of the people who need to be in the room to make the interesting sort of brainstorming session work and progress are there. But that doesn't happen every day. So we can start to schedule sort of things around that, and make sure that we're all in the same place when it matters, but can be remote from home or really anywhere for when it doesn't. And my view is that we'll probably end up something like this, in what I call the 33 model. So 30 weeks a year, spend 3 days a week in the office. So some time in the office so you can connect with your team, have those conversations, learn through osmosis and overhearing other people and other teams for around 30 weeks of the year. So, that doesn't necessarily mean 30 weeks in a row. Maybe there's a week and you're working with, or your parents are going somewhere, you want to visit family or whatever, you work from a remote location for 1 or 2 weeks. It allows you to continue to have that connection to the company, while also getting some of the benefits of that blended model and of, remote and hybrid work. So that kind of takes me to the last section, which is, what does the world need for us to get there? So obviously we're still experimenting, and we'll see what the demand of individuals are and what the sort of needs of companies are as we move forward. And I think we're in the infancy of all of this. But I think for us to get to more people living this blended model, a couple things need to happen. So one, there's a tech element to it. There are different tools and sort of other things to help manage the way that sort of this new world of work is working. And actually, I'll talk about how some of the things I'm working on tie to that and how we have used them in Ion on the ConnectX side. But first, let me introduce sort of this theory around human capital that we have. So people or talent, anyone who's looking for a job today, human capital is the lifeblood of the economy. And yet human capital markets are really inefficient. So the way that human capital is managed within a company, across companies, is very inefficient. And in terms of the importance of people and talent, and I'm sure you've heard this in other areas, most companies, if they raise money, and it's becoming a little harder as fundraising is starting to tighten, but as companies raise money or a new venture raises money, the thing that they spend it on typically is people. So actually human capital, good people, good talent is scarcer in a lot of cases than capital to fund an organization. Um, and it's just such a critical resource. Fortune 500 companies typically spend over 60% of their sort of cost is spent on people. So being efficient in the way we manage people and the way we sort of mentor people and the way we retain people is really important. And if we think about sort of the market of human capital across the industry, you kind of two sides of it. So, any of us are in the middle. We're the sort of resource here. And we typically early in our careers pay some sort of educational system to get skills, to get knowledge, to learn. So we're sort of buying skills and knowledge from educators. And then we're selling our skills and our experience and our time to a company in exchange for a salary. So that's kind of how we think of the market. And it's highly inefficient, as I mentioned. And I think part of this is due to a lack of standardization and commoditization of people. And it makes sense. People are really, really complicated. But there's a few root causes that we're kind of focused on. So one, there's not really a standardized set of skills to benchmark against. And anyone who's made a resume knows that you have your little skills section of technologies you've worked with. It's just random words on a PDF document. The resume is a tool from the 1950s, literally our grandparents' era, that's still being used today. And there are tools like LinkedIn that have come out and tried to digitize that. But I think anyone who on the hiring side looks at LinkedIn knows it's all kind of fake. Anyone can post whatever they want on LinkedIn. You can endorse your friends for skills on LinkedIn. So there's no sort of trust in it. It's a good starting point to represent your experience. But it does not sort of create any validation or sort of trust in someone is. So the result is we need to go through long interview processes in order to find jobs and to try to figure out if someone's actually a good fit for the role. And then the last is psychological and behavioral aspects are subjective. So companies use interviewers typically to figure out if you're going to be a good fit from a behavior perspective within the team. And that's because there's not a better way to do it. But I think it's quite a suboptimal way. It's time consuming and it's bias filled. And there's a lot of sort of issues with this. But we believe, and sort of I personally have been quite close to this, but we believe that the human capital markets will need to continue to transform to support the future of work. And this slide here, we've got a number of different sort of market asset classes that ION is involved in. And we have this slide of sort of the digitalization curve that we show in the other contexts. So equities are incredibly digital. You typically don't call someone to place an order of sort of equity, an equity trade or buy some stock. Commodity management is more analog. And really human capital management is the most analog. So we think there's a huge opportunity here to really work on making the human capital allocation process more efficient. And if we think about equities, it's easy. So it makes sense it got digitized faster. If you want to buy 1/16.5 billionth of Apple or one share of Apple, you just place an order for it. But every share of Apple is identical and it's quite easy to match supply and demand. Commodities are a bit harder. So if you've got sort of a rail car of grain, there's complexity in it. So rail cars in different countries are different sizes. So the volume of grain is obviously going to be different. If it's rained and the grain is wet, it's going to be heavier. So there might not be as much. So there's some complexities in there when you're trying to digitize sort of a physical commodity. that make it a little more difficult. And then the last piece here is physical location. So if a rail car of grain, if you want to buy it and you need it to produce something, and it's halfway around the world, it's not as quick and instant as buying that share of Apple. But if we think of people, all of us are incredibly, incredibly complex. And this is why this hasn't become more optimized or digitized. We have skills, we have abilities, we've got sort of different behaviors and personalities. We've got different goals. Not everyone wants to use everything they're good at. They might have a view of what they want to do with their career or their life. We're all in different locations. So I think this is a hugely difficult puzzle to solve. And while we're focused on improving it, it's not something that's going to change in 1 year, 10 years, or maybe even 100 years. But we want to make progress towards it. And that's what ConnectX does. We're a talent management suite with skills at our core. So we help organizations do more with their existing people. And we do that by helping companies understand who they have within their company, what skills, what aspirations, what experience, and more. Make it searchable so that people in the company all have a view of who else is in the company. We use that then to connect people to projects and people to roles. So not just saying, hey, we need someone to do this, and here are the 5 people in front of me, which one should I pick? Really thinking about who's the best person in the large organization to fill a project or to fill a role. Continuously measuring sort of how people are doing using skill-based feedback tied to accomplishments. So it's very sort of objective. And then that obviously reinforces the understanding we have of people in the company. And then using sort of the gap between sort of what you're good at and what you want to do to help match people to mentors and to other learning resources to help them continue to grow in their career using our AI. So we've got a whole platform based on this, which we've been hard at work on. We've used internally for about 3 years, and we've just launched externally to the market. So really excited to continue to sort of innovate in this space. And I think that the outcome is quite good for companies. They get work done faster. There's less time spent on these manual activities of management of people and more time of the work actually getting done. But I think more importantly for individuals, we want to help people empower to have better lives and careers. A great outcome would be for every single person to wake up every day in the world and say, hey, I love what I'm doing. I'm really excited about my job and I can't wait to go to work. And I think that's quite an ambitious goal. But it's kind of what we're striving for is why can't we make sure that we're matching the right person who would love this type of work to the right job that needs to be filled. And then I think on just a quick view on the other side of my sort of role, we've been focusing, and if we think back to the digital nomad piece, Pangea is an app I developed, and it's a social pin map that helps people understand where their network have been, where they are currently, and where they're going to be in the future. So if I know people in my network have lived somewhere, they studied in Rome or they studied in California, I know they might have good recommendations for that location. Where people are currently is people are moving around more, traveling more, potentially working from interesting locations. Oh, where are my friends? And there's obviously tools that do this now, but Find My Friends and the Snap Map and other things like that, they're all exact location. So it's quite personal and quite intimate to know that I'm on a specific street corner eating dinner. I don't necessarily want to share that with everyone, but I'm okay with sharing with kind of anyone that I'm in New York at the moment. And then where people will be in the future. All of us, as we're planning trips or planning sort of travel for work or for personal reasons, you typically know you're going to be somewhere before you actually show up there. But that data is super fragmented and super opaque, and no one can see sort of where others in their network are. So by bringing this together, the when and the where people are going to be, it starts to also provide an interesting dynamic to make those interactions in new locations more meaningful. And if we think back to that sort of outside concept of co-working and co-living in interesting places, and remote year concept of working in a community in different places, and also the importance of in-person work, if you start to optimize where people are, you could actually do the cool in-person meetings that need to happen in some of those cool locations. So that's kind of the other sort of side of what I'm spending my time on. And then the last thing we need, I think, for this shift to happen is companies need to get on board. And I've been with Ion for 8 years, and one of the really exciting things I think about Ion is it's a very global company. We have offices all over the world. And we're a hybrid company. So typically people are coming to the office 3 days a week. That varies by team and varies by location. But one of the unique things, and I think especially as you grow in your career, it certainly doesn't happen in your first year or two necessarily. But having the opportunity to visit some of these other locations, we have a team in India that we will have these sort of in-person workshops with a couple times a year. Really great experience. And then similarly, if I'm traveling somewhere, and I was in Italy over the summer for a wedding of my friend, I went to our Pisa office because I know a handful of people there, and a good opportunity to go to different locations. So again, I wouldn't say that at Ion we're sending people to random places for no purpose. But as you grow in your career, we are quite a global company, and there's lots of opportunities to get involved with different people from different cultures in different parts of the world, which I think is a great way as we think about sort of the future and what that looks like. So all of these things sort of are interconnected. ConnectX on the sort of who and the what. So who's in a company, what work needs to get done, how do we match that? Where are people going to be and when are they going to be there is what Pangea is focused on. And then Ion, or really any company, is the why behind the what, behind the work. So all of this can work together to help us get towards that future, and that, I think, really exciting future for work. But whatever this is, it's happening now. The future of work is now. And I think we all need to stay tuned and be a part of it. And it's quite an exciting time to be starting a career. So anyway, thank you very much. I'm Matt Gray. Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you, Matt. It's been a very interesting speech. A lot of smart insights about the future of work and the present of work, as you said at the end, because we are experiencing a lot of innovations, and it's time to bring this innovation also in the how in the hours in our life, and the most important part of our life, that it's the job, the work, the job, the way we earn the wage. So
Yeah.
I thank you again to be our guest. I just waiting to have some questions, because we have a delay on the technician, and I know from the other speeches this morning that some questions can arrive later after some seconds.
Well, as we're waiting, I think what you said, work is what we spend so much of our time doing. It's one of the most important things we do with our lives, and that's one of the when you think of making sure people are working on things that are exciting to them, that's one of the reasons why it's so important, because no one should spend 40 years of their life 5 days a week doing something they don't like. I think that's not fair in the world today.
Also, the way in which you are doing is important. So the new normal. So the things that you explained before and showed before, and the possibility to work in a place for a company that is located miles away. It's something that now we are accustomed, but in the past, of course, was something very, very strange for a lot of companies. It's still strange to think. So we need to innovate our mind, our mindset, and the contribution like yours are very important. So I thank you again. I think there are no questions. Yes, there is a question. It's from Vanessa. She's asking you, what is the real impact on work-life balance in your country with remote working now? And what are the predictions for the future? Yes, you are living in New York, is something different from Italy. Please.
Yeah, absolutely. And good question. And I think there's sort of good things and bad things that come from a work-life balance perspective with all these new tools and all of these technologies. So, you could be always on, right? You have access to your email on your phone. You have access to Teams and chat on your phone. And I think this is something that a lot of people struggle with, is where should I put the line between when I'm available to my company and when I'm focused on myself? I would say the tools have done a great job in the last couple of years of adding new features to help make it easier. So in Microsoft Teams, which is what Ian uses for collaboration, there's like by default now quiet hours and quiet times. So you won't get notifications outside of hours, which is quite important. So, I think there's some potentially things we need to watch out for to make sure we're not sort of working more than we're intending to, or really just spending time or focus or energy on work when we should be recharging. But at the same time, I think because of the sort of distributed model, and because people can work from new locations, the ability for people to get more out of their lives is, and really, like, in a way, balance more on the life side of the work-life balance is becoming more present. And I'll give an example. Some of our first-year analysts in New York, they typically are in the office, 3 days a week, sometimes 5 days a week, sometimes 1 day a week, right? It can vary, and we're quite flexible. But when I was in my first year at Ion, in the US, you get 15 vacation days. So it's quite limited. So there were a lot of things where you want to go visit your friend in another city, but you can't leave until Friday night, and you have to be back by Monday morning. And so it would either be a really short trip, or flights would be really expensive. So I think a lot of those things I probably didn't do my first year working. And I look at our analysts now who are taking advantage of the situation in a good way, and saying, okay, well, I'm going to work remotely Thursday and Friday from some other place in the country, and they're working and they're getting their stuff done, and they're available during the day. But then when they log off at 6 p.m., they're already with their friends, or they're already with their family in those other parts of the world. And I think that flexibility makes it easier for people to get more, or have more ability to sort of do the things they want to in life, while also continuing to get the work done. So anyway, some good impacts, some bad impacts on tech, but I think overall a net positive for people.
Okay, yes, I agree with you. Yes. So I think we finished here. Thank you again, Matthew, for being with us. And of course, here there are all your contacts, so people can be in contact with you. I hope we will host you again in one of our next events. And thank you. Bye-bye.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Bye.